When you hear the name Phil Spector, what's the first thing you picture? Is it this towering, beautiful, symphonic pop music that basically defined an entire generation? Or is it a mugshot? Today, we're getting into one of the most brilliant and frankly disturbing figures in all of music history. Let's try to make sense of a man who was, without a doubt, both a genius and a monster. I mean, look at this. This slide right here captures the whole crazy story. On one side, you've got this absolute game changer of a producer, the first tycoon of teen, the guy who built the wall of sound. And on the other side, a convicted murderer. The entire story of Phil Spector is right here, this impossible, jarring conflict between the art and the artist. You know, this one phrase, it unlocks so much of his story. When Spector was just 9 years old, his father died by suicide, and these were the words they put on his gravestone. That trauma just seemed to hang over him his entire life, fueling this desperate need for control and this intense yearning for a kind of love he could only seem to create on records. And then, get this, 9 years later, a teenage Phil Spector turns that very epitaph into his first #1 hit. His entire career was literally born from a family tragedy. So that first hit, yeah, that was just the beginning. Spector figured out really fast that his real talent wasn't being the one on stage, but being the one controlling every single sound from behind the glass of a recording studio. And in the early 1960s, he invented a sound that would change absolutely everything. The wall of sound. Just the name itself is incredible, right? It wasn't just some studio trick, it was a whole philosophy. Spector basically treated the entire studio like one giant instrument. He'd cram a room full of legendary musicians. We're talking 3 pianos, 5 guitars, a full orchestra, all playing the exact same part at the same time. All the sound would just bleed into every microphone, creating this massive, echoing, beautiful mess that just exploded out of those tiny little AM radio speakers like nothing anyone had ever heard before. And you can just see how fast he blew up. I mean, from a #1 hit as a teenager to owning his own record label at just 21 years old. By the mid-60s, with these monster hits like Be My Baby and You've Lost That Love and Feeling, he was completely untouchable. He was the undisputed king of the studio. And if you want to put his power into perspective, in the 1960s alone, he was the producer behind 18 top 10 singles in the US. Just think about that for a second. He wasn't just making music. He was literally crafting the emotional soundtrack for an entire decade. But while the whole world was falling in love with these huge, romantic pop symphonies, something very, very different was happening behind closed doors. Because under all that musical perfection, a really dark story of control and fear was starting to take hold. This quote, this is from Ronnie Spector, the lead singer of the Ronettes, and Phil's wife during his absolute peak. She was the voice of Be My Baby, maybe his greatest masterpiece. But she said that in private, her life with him was a complete nightmare. She called it a prison, built by the very same man who was creating these songs about perfect, endless devotion.
And it was this terrifying pattern of control. He sabotaged Ronnie's career. He wouldn't let her perform. She claimed he even threatened her life. The detail about adopting kids as a surprise Christmas present it's just chilling. And years later, his adopted sons would come forward with their own horrible stories about being held captive. The grand love he was selling on his records was a total fantasy that he seemed completely incapable of feeling himself.
So, after stepping back for a bit at the end of the 60s, Spector came back and he landed one of the biggest jobs you could possibly imagine. But this comeback, it was also when his erratic, paranoid, and just plain dangerous behavior started to really spiral out of control. His talent, you just couldn't deny it. He was working with absolute legends. He was the guy they brought in to save the Beatles' messy Get Back sessions, which ended up becoming the album Let It Be. But even that was controversial. He threw strings and a choir all over the long and winding road, and Paul McCartney was publicly furious about it. But then he helped shape masterpieces like George Harrison's All Things Must Pass and John Lennon's Imagine. The genius was still there, no question. But the chaos and the creativity were becoming the same thing. The stories from these sessions are just infamous. When he was recording Lennon's rock and roll album, the studio was just fueled by paranoia. Spector was apparently waving guns around all the time, and in one insane moment, he actually fired a pistol right next to John Lennon's head. It was a terrifying preview of what was coming.
After the 70s, Spector pretty much became a recluse. His public appearances got weirder and weirder, and then nothing. Until one night in February 2003, when his private darkness exploded into a very public crime scene.
This right here, this is the question that would define the entire rest of his life, and ultimately, his legacy. Spector met an actress, Lana Clarkson, at a nightclub. He took her back to his mansion, this secluded place he called the Pyrenees Castle. What actually happened inside that house would be debated in courtrooms for years.
But this quote, this became the absolute core of the case against him. It's from a 911 call made by Spector's own driver. The driver told the dispatcher that he saw Spector walk out of the house, gun in hand, and say those 5 chilling words. Inside, Lana Clarkson was dead. A single gunshot. The legal fight was long and it was messy. Spector's lawyers claimed Clarkson's death was a freak, accidental suicide. The first trial in 2007 actually ended with a hung jury, but the prosecution went at it again. And this time they brought in all this evidence about Spector's long history of threatening women with guns. Finally, in 2009, 6 years after Lana Clarkson's death, a jury convicted Phil Spector of second-degree murder. So trying to square the two sides of Phil Spector, it feels difficult, maybe even impossible. He died in prison back in 2021, leaving behind this legacy that's just completely fractured and deeply, deeply disturbing.
And this final chart just lays it all out, the stark contradiction. You've got the Grammy winner, the Hall of Famer, the guy they called the first auteur producer, like a film director who had total artistic control. But that exact same need for control that made him a genius in the studio also made him a tyrant at home, and it ultimately led to murder, abuse, and a life sentence. I think this quote from musician Stevie Van Zandt just nails it. Spector's entire catalog was built on these huge, sweeping songs about teenage love and devotion, but his own life was proof that he was completely incapable of living up to the very ideals he perfected on tape. The art was the beautiful fantasy. The artist was the tragic, violent reality. And so we're left with this really difficult question. With someone like Phil Spector, can you even do it? Is it possible? Can you listen to Be My Baby with its soaring, innocent plea for love without thinking about everything else we now know? It's a question without any easy answers, and that complicated, dark, and undeniable legacy is what he leaves behind.